Hi everybody. Okay, so Unit 12 of Biology 2, we are starting on the nervous system. And just like a lot of the other systems we've already talked about, this one is pretty much a whole body system. It is does have some places where it is a little more centered. Obviously, the brain is kind of what I'm talking about there. But it, like if we had a drawing and we showed where the nervous system was in the body, it would pretty much be everywhere with some of the peripheral nerves and that kind of thing. So anyway, the nervous system is responsible for controlling the body and also for communicating from one part of the body to the other. It's responsible for maintaining and regulating body homeostasis. That's a big deal because remember, a lot of your cells only work well at very specific temperatures or pH or whatever it is. And so they do, there's Lulu, they do a lot more, or your nervous system does a lot more than just, help you sense pain or whatever it is. So anyway, the functions are that the body monitors changes inside and out of the body, and these are a lot of times called stimuli. It helps your body, I guess you would say, to process, to interpret that input, that stimuli, make decisions about what to do about it. Like this is the, you touch something hot and instantaneously your body processes that, interprets what is happening, and then tells you to take your hand away. So it's very quick on that. And then it also can cause a response by affecting very specific organs, muscles or glands to take action. So to release a hormone or to start digestion or whatever it is. Okay, so the nervous system has two major parts. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. This is the big one for interpreting and commanding. So it is the control center. We'll talk more about halfway through these notes, specifically about those two parts. In between then and now, we'll talk mostly about just nerves. Anyway, and then the second major part is the peripheral nervous system, and this is the nerves that extend out from the central nervous system, so that extend from your brain and from your spinal cord. These are the information carriers, so they take the information to your brain through the spinal cord, and then as that information comes back, they carry it back to the specific organs or the muscles that need to do stuff. And so that picture shows the two parts a little bit different, I think, than the picture I have for you. But again, notice whole body, when you put the two together, everything is touched, I guess, internally and externally by your nervous system. Okay, so now nervous tissue. I'm going to run through the different parts and the different types of cells, the different classifications of them. And so, just kind of bear with me as we go through all of this. It's kind of interesting. Some of the terms might be kind of weird, but in class, we'll of course go into more depth as you guys have questions. Okay, so first off with nervous tissue, you have supporting cells, and these basically kind of are a scaffolding for the neurons. They support, they nourish, they defend. And in your central nervous system, they are called neuroglia, and that roughly translates to nerve glue. Sometimes you will hear these referred to as glial cells. They have branching processes, which basically means just kind of these lines kind of coming out, or these branches. Those are the processes. That's actually on a neuron. Down here is the glial cell. But anyway, but those are the processes. They are much smaller than neurons. And much may be kind of an exaggeration. In this picture, let me erase what I drew on there because it was kind of dumb. In this picture, this darker purple, this is the neuron, this thing. And then let's see, this kind of little one, this is one of the support cells, so, or one of the neuroglia. So they are, I guess, significantly smaller. They outnumber the neurons depending on the area 50 to 1, and they make up at least half of your brain's mass. So the actual nerve cells, like doing all the stuff, are not, it's not just what your brain is. There are lots of pieces in there taking care of the nerves. All right, so the 4 types of neuroglia. First off, we have an astrocyte. That's what this picture is here on your screen. It is the most numerous of the glial cells, and it clings to the neurons and to the capillaries. So it is kind of a connector between the two. It helps in gas exchange, helps the O2 get to the neurons and then get rid of the CO2, and basically controls the environment around the neuron. And it is, so it's kind of like a little kind of a bodyguard / servant, however you want to look at it, to keep that neuron healthy. A second glial cell is the microglial, and so there's a little picture of it over there. It's different than the picture I have for you. I couldn't find that same picture. I don't have a neuron in there to compare it, but it is, again, smaller than a neuron. So it's small, it's oval shaped, kind of lots of little kind of thorny processes. So notice how much, these have little branches coming off. And it is essentially a type of macrophage, which we used when we described white blood cells. It is similar to a white blood cell, and it protects the central nervous system from foreign microorganisms. So it is basically the immune system part of the nervous system, cleans up any dead neural tissue, helps engulf it and then destroy it. The ependymal cells, they are squamous, which means kind of flat or kind of rectangle shaped cells that have cilia. So you can see down there in that picture that they're kind of labeled. They line the central brain cavity and the spinal cavity, and they form a permeable layer between the spinal fluid and then the brain or spinal cord. Their cilia helps to circulate the fluid. The fluid's main job is to act as a cushion around the brain and the spinal cord, and kind of nourish and keep everything kind of that homeostasis situation happening for those cells. All right, and then last in the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes. So on that picture there, it's the blue, very similar to astrocytes, but just not as many branches coming off. It wraps around thicker neuron fibers. It helps provide insulation. And that's important because that helps the nerve transmission go smoothly. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, you have 2 types of support cells, satellite cells and Schwann cells. The satellite cells in that picture are kind of the purple layer around the yellow, and they are just kind of a layer of protection. The Schwann cells surround and form what they call the myelin sheaths, and they're typically around the thicker neuron fibers. They again act as these phagocytes, so like kind of the cleanup, immune system part, help get rid of damaged nerve cells. They help some in nerve regeneration, although that's that's a very slow process if it happens. But so they are basically insulation. Sorry, Lulu's having issues. Okay, all right. So now neurons themselves. So these are like the working cells of the nervous system. So these are, what are telling your body what to do. 3 special characteristics, first of all, extreme longevity. If you take good care of yourself, and your nervous system as part of that, nerve cells will live and function for an entire lifetime. They are amitotic, which means once they reach maturity, once they actually start working, once their function starts when you are in the womb, as far as directing and guiding motion and movement and senses, they no longer divide to form new cells. So essentially the number of nerve cells that you were born with, the number of neurons, that's the number that you've got. And so if they are destroyed or damaged, they don't typically regenerate, particularly the ones in your central nervous system. Neurons have a very high metabolic rate, so they need a constant supply of glucose and oxygen. If your body is forced to pick where oxygen goes, it goes to your brain, because neurons can only survive for a few minutes without oxygen. And so that's why you'll hear about people, when someone stops breathing, I guess I should start with that. When someone stops breathing, that's typically why, CPR is done, is to keep the brain alive, and because without the brain, nothing else will survive. Okay, neuron anatomy, and I have a picture coming up here in a couple of slides, so we'll kind of go through all of these. But so first off, you have the cell body, and so it's there's a large spherical nucleus. Not in my pictures necessarily, but in good microscope slides, you have an obvious nucleolus, which is a little part inside the nucleus. Has all the normal organelles, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, all that stuff, except centrioles. And centrioles are only used during mitosis, which you remember we just said the neurons don't do that, so you don't have them. Most are located in the central nervous system, and they're protected there by your skull, by your cranium, and then by your rib cage, and I should have put in your spine. I wonder if I have a typo there. But so that's where they are. And then you have the neuron processes, which are the branches, and they are the extensions from the cell body in the central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. You have the cell body and the processes, which are called tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, you mostly just have these processes, and those typically are called nerves. Okay, so now two types of neuron processes, and this is kind of a jumbled page. I apologize for that. So you've got dendrites and axons. So dendrites are short, kind of tapering, so they're thicker close to the body of the cell, then they get skinnier, and highly branched extensions. They are receptive areas, so they bring in information from the surroundings. Each nerve cell typically has multiple dendrites, and then there is one axon. Again, there's probably exceptions to that, but one axon, it's a single, very, very skinny process. It is pretty much a constant diameter, so it doesn't get any skinnier or any thicker. And it carries nerve impulses between either cell body, so it carries it onto another nerve cell, excuse me, or to tissues or organs. And so it carries on the information. It kind of carries the instructions onto the next step. Axons can be very long. They can run all the way from your lower back down to your big toe, so the length of your leg essentially. They can be short, it just kind of depends. They don't have a lot of branches along the length of the axon, but they may have a few. And they typically end in short, multiple little branches called telodendria. And these are used to release chemicals into the surrounding tissue. So they are the ones that carry on the chemical signal that the nerve is trying to send. With these processes, and we mentioned this earlier, they are somewhat insulated. The myelin sheath is a protective layer of fat. Essentially, it's white, kind of a fatty substance. It covers the nerve fibers, but only the axons. And it helps to insulate the fibers. It helps to speed up the nerve impulse conduction. And so it's just like, on a wire, typically you have a layer of rubber around it so that the electricity flows straight through and doesn't disperse out to the sides of the wire, if that makes sense. Myelin sheath works the same way. In the central nervous system, that's what the oligodendrocytes oligodendrocytes are responsible for, and then in the peripheral nervous system, that's the Schwann cells. Okay, so here's the picture. So you have the dendrite over here. I know you can read, but I'll circle it for you anyway. Notice the big cell body in our drawing. You can just see the nucleus, but there's also, you would find a nucleolus along with all of the other organelles minus the centrioles. And then it's covered in yellow, but those are the myelin sheaths, the Schwann cells. The axon is this length. So the axon's running right through here. And then when you get to what they call the axon terminal, that's where the telodendrocytes are that disperse the chemicals into the surrounding and cause the reaction. And so this is kind of the typical, like I said, it can be very short, very long. Just depends on kind of the location. Okay, so now structural classification of neurons. You have multipolar neurons, first of all. These have 3 or more processes, and this is the most common type of neuron. Some may only have dendrocytes and actually lack the axon, so they're just taking in information. And this is a major neuron in your brain, and some in your spinal cord, but mainly your brain because they're just taking in information. Then your bipolar neurons, in my picture, I didn't realize this is in the wrong order, but here's bipolar, so look at the right thing. It has 2 processes, an axon on one side, a dendrocyte on the other. These are rare because they are really only found in special organs like your eyes and your nose. And so they, the dendrite takes in information and is passing it, and it goes through the cell body and then passes on through as it's interpreted, like your vision, for instance, as it is interpreted on through with the dendrocytes. So these are found in your peripheral nervous system, so it's not in your brain or spinal cord, it's outside of that point. And then a unipolar neuron, which is our middle picture up here, has one process. It's very short. It's like this little bit right here that splits into proximal and distal dendrites. These are sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system, so they are taking in different sensations about the environment or about what's going on, and then just it keeps being passed on until it gets to the brain and it is interpreted, and then your body and your brain tells your body what to do. Okay, so now the functional classification of neurons. You have sensory neurons, so these are sometimes called afferent. They carry impulses from the receptors in the skin or the organs to the central nervous system, basically to the brain. Most of these are unipolar. And then you have the motor neurons, or efferent. They carry instructions basically back from the brain to the muscles and glands. And most of these are multipolar. And then you have association neurons, sometimes called interneurons, and they are between the sensory and the motor neurons, and they are just transmitting the signals. Most of these are multipolar. These make up about 99% of the body's neurons, so they're just kind of the in-between part, and so they're just carrying the signals from place to place. Okay, so now the signals, these signals that I've been talking about, the actual transmission of the signals occurs at what are called synapses. And this is the gap or the junction between 2 neurons or a neuron and an effector cell, so like muscle cell or organs. They occur between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another. And so they're where it goes from one nerve to the next. And there are 2 types of synapses. Electrical, this is a little less common, but this allows the flow of current carrying ions from one neuron to the other. You see this a lot of times in your heart and some of your smooth muscles. These types of synapses are really good for synchronizing, for keeping kind of a beat, for example, like in your heart. And so when you have an EKG, that's what they are measuring, is the current as it is carried from one spot to the other. So that's the beep beep a beep, you know, like when they have the thing on the little screen, like in medical shows, Grey's Anatomy. And so this one's a little less common, but is fairly easily measured, and the heart, of course, is the best example. And then you have a chemical synapses, way more common. This allows the flow, of neurotransmitters. And in this picture, all of these little dots, like I'm circling the whole thing, but the dots inside there, those are chemicals. Those are the neurotransmitters. They open and close ion channels, and this influences the membrane potential. Again, that's kind of an electrical thing. And they excite or inhibit the receiving neuron, and that can either stop the nerve signal or help the nerve signal continue on to the next one. And so this gap, as they have labeled right here, here's synapsis. This is kind of this gap. That's the synapsis. And then you have the axon up here. So here's the axon, and it is carrying this signal back down here to the dendrite, and so it carries it across that gap by these different little chemicals, and they go into the receivers, the receptors, and then they continue on with, here's this action potential. That's this red arrow coming in here, and so it's, you know, it's coming down the wire, basically gets to a point, it passes on, and then it just keeps on going down the wire. And so anyway, so it's a very, very quick system. It seems like, well, you know, listening to me describe it, you're like, my gosh, that takes forever because I talk a lot. But your body is very quick and very, very highly functional to carry on signals. Okay, so now onto the central nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord. And so we're going to start with the brain and start with the outside. There are coverings on the brain. And they, as a group, are called the meninges, and there are 3 layers. When we dissect our brain, we will be able to see the dura mater. The other 2 that are on this page that we'll talk about most likely are so thin that we won't be aware that they're there. But in a living person, these are there and have a very distinct function. Okay, so first off, the dura mater. This is a very thick membrane, has blood vessels. It is very tightly connected to the inner surface, so the inside of your skull. Again, when we dissect it, it'll be a little different. It'll have dried out, essentially, even though it's been preserved. It will feel, or they have in the past at least, felt like kind of like hard plastic almost. But anyway, so lots of blood vessels, very nourished, and its job essentially is to kind of keep the brain from jiggling around too much. Then you have the arachnoid membrane, and so on our picture, it is these little kind of white lines. It's called the arachnoid membrane because it looks kind of like spider webs, like cobwebs, and it fills in kind of the gaps and is, again, a support system. It's trying to keep the brain in place so that, you know, if you nod your head or shake your head, your brain doesn't jiggle around. Then you have the pia mater or pia mater. It's a very thin membrane right on the surface of the brain and on the spinal cord. It has lots of small blood vessels, again, for nourishment and as a kind of an added protection to your brain. Then you have in here, kind of filling in the gaps, the cerebrospinal fluid, and it flows between the arachnoid membrane and that pia mater, fills in the ventricles. I know that's like a heart word, but it's basically just means spaces. So it fills in the spaces in the brain matter and then in the central canal around the spinal cord, nourishes those cells, cushions those cells. And so this spinal fluid is very important to the health of your brain and your spine. Excuse me. Okay, so here we go, the brain. It's approximately 2% of the body weight, so about 3 pounds in the average adult, but it receives 20% of the blood volume. Again, that's because without your brain, you are not going to be alive. And so your body knows to keep it very nourished. Typically in a living person, it is pink and gray. Pink because of the blood flow, gray because the cell bodies in dendrites have a gray color, and that's typically known as gray matter. Obviously, the brains that we dissect are not living, so they'll be kind of different shades of gray. The brain itself has 7 regions. We're going to talk about the cerebrum for a little bit. That's the top of the brain. So it's sits right up here. It is divided down the middle, so sagittally, into 2 large halves called hemispheres. So you have your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere, and they are connected by a thick layer of white matter, and that white matter helps the 2 halves of your brain connect. And so this is why, if something is controlled by the right brain, it can transfer information over to your left brain, and your whole body can do it, or whatever it is. There are all kinds of psychology studies on, if you're more of a right brain or left brain, if you're more artistic or logical, and all those kinds of things. And that's very a very true statement. But just in terms of function, like walking, playing a sport, or anything that really requires coordination between both halves, that happens because that white matter. All right, so on the cerebrum, you have these little raised ridges called gyri, and so they are, or gyri, again, I've heard it both ways. We'll see these, and then you have these indented areas called fissures, and in there you have the cerebral cortex, or what you see, I guess I should say, when you look at the brain, and it contains 12 to 15 billion neurons, and this is your conscious actions. All right, so now the 4 lobes of the cerebrum, taking a little sidestep into the cerebrum here for a minute. The 4 main lobes, 4 lobes, excuse me. You have the frontal lobe, which on my picture there is kind of that greenish color. This controls mental functions, reasoning or rational thought, logic. This is your planning area. It's where you memorize. This controls your ability to speak. Typically you don't really think about what these areas are doing until you have some kind of head injury or brain injury. This lobe is the one, and I know there's a name for it and I'm blanking on it while we're talking here. This is the area of the brain that you see damaged in football players. When they, tackle someone, they hit someone, this part of the brain, it gets hit the most. And so, you hear about men who've been playing football for a long time who begin to act irrationally, begin to have trouble with their memory, or things like that, and whose personalities change very drastically. Typically that is damage to the frontal lobe, and so any kind of head injury here can cause problems with those different characteristics in a person. The parietal lobe is more towards the back, the top back of your head, and this area is responsible for sensation. So this is where your sense of touch, pain, pressure, temperature, pardon me, kind of external conditions are kind of sensed or translated in this area. Your occipital lobe is that purple on the very back of your head. This is vision and memory for object symbols. This is where all your information about reading is stored. You know how to translate letters into words. Vision, this is why if you fall and hit the back of your head really hard, you see stars, because they're connected. The temporal lobe, so again under your temporal bone, this is where your sense of hearing, your ears are right there, and smell kind of come through. This is where the memory of word pronunciation and song melodies are held, I guess you could say. And so again, a lot of times when people suffer different things, like a stroke, for example, they can detect which area of the brain is affected by which of these characteristics or which of these things people start having trouble with. And so we have, a pretty good map of what goes on in what different parts of the brain. Okay, so now the regions of the brain, the cerebrum, we've gotten through, and I have a big picture that we'll label together in class that has all these. So kind of hang with me until we get there. You have the thalamus, first of all. This is right in the center of the brain. Two kind of oval masses, again, kind of left and right. They're connected by white matter. These receive impulses, and then we'll send kind of the important ones onto the parietal lobe. So remember, parietal lobe is the one that senses pain and temperature, touch, pressure, all those things. So if it's like a hot stove, your parietal lobe is the one that says, get your hand back. And so it's kind of your thalamus kind of, what's the word? Kind of censors that information coming in. Is this important enough to send on or not? This is the first part of your brain to be aware of environmental changes. And again, if they're big environmental changes that could cause problems, that they get sent on. Also, if you're falling asleep as you're listening to me, your thalamus is letting you down, because this is the part that keeps a person awake and alert. Let's see, then we have the hypothalamus. And it's very small. It's about 4 grams typically, and it is near the center of the brain also. This one controls involuntary action. So this regulates your body temperature, your blood volume, fluid balance. You have no control over those. It does have some control over appetite and emotional expression. This is why they think for some people there is a definite relationship between things like comfort eating. This also controls your pituitary gland and its release of hormones, which is a big deal. And we'll talk more about the pituitary gland when we talk about the endocrine system. But your hypothalamus makes 2 different hormones, which again we'll talk about more. So it is part of your nervous system and your endocrine system, because it does that. All right, then we have the midbrain, and this is between the thalamus and the pons, which we'll get to next. And it allows motor impulses to pass from the pons to and the cerebellum to the cerebrum, so the top of your brain from the bottom of your brain. Controls body movement, also controls posture, mainly of your head. It's involved in vision and hearing. So again, with some of these, depending on different problems in your brain or damage or stroke, if certain abilities are affected, they can kind of pinpoint where the damage is. The pons is a large egg-shaped region. It's between the medulla and the midbrain, which again we'll get to. It's almost all white matter, and it controls involuntary respiration. So until now, as I've been talking, I haven't been thinking about my breathing, but since I'm saying this now, I'm like, oh, I need to breathe more, or whatever it is. But when you're sitting there watching a movie or reading a book, or anything where your brain is otherwise occupied, your pons is keeping you breathing. It also controls chewing, facial expression, your response to sounds, eyeball movement. So a lot to do with just kind of your face in general. Then we've got the medulla oblongata. It is continuous with your spinal cord. It's a relay center between the 2 of them. It contains centers for respiration, blood vessel diameter, so how big or how small, your heart, so shushmax, your heart pumping, all those different things. And so again, not something that you necessarily are in control of. It's also your reflex center. This is controls sneezing, coughing, swallowing, vomiting, things again that you have some control over, but not completely. Okay, and then the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. It is below and to the back of the cerebrum, and there's again 2 hemispheres are connected by white matter. This monitors, helps adjust your body actions that your cerebrum has kind of interpreted and is telling your body what to do. your cerebellum kind of gets all that going. It's totally subconscious. You have no control over this. This is in other mammals sometimes referred to as like the brain stem. In other mammals, remember scientifically humans are considered mammals. In other mammals, the cerebellum is not so small compared to the cerebrum. Our cerebrum is very well developed because of our abilities, and because God made us that way. Really, it's not really because of our abilities, but because He gave us more logic and more reasoning and more of those things. And so anyway, your cerebellum is keeping you alive because you're not having to think about it. Okay, so there's the big picture of all of those things, and the only thing that is not on there, let me see, there's some extra stuff. The only thing that's not on there, I think, is the hypothalamus, and it is going to be somewhere like right in here. I'll put an X because that'll make it easier. So it's going to be somewhere in there, but when we go through this together in class, we'll make sure that everybody's kind of got it. So it has some of the lobes on there, and then it shows you the other parts that we've kind of that we've gone through. All right, this page we will label together. And then last thing, the spinal cord. So this is the second major part of the central nervous system. So it runs from the medulla oblongata to the first or second lumbar vertebrae. So way down, at the base of your, your back. And it is basically a mass of nerves, and it's made of 31 segments with pairs of nerves coming off each section. The pairs are for the left and right side. And the cross section, that's what I have a picture of there, is two masses, and they're joined by a little narrow bridge with a little canal. I think on the picture it says central canal right there in the middle. The outer layer is the white matter, and the inner is the center. Kind of looks like an upside down butterfly to me. They call this the H shape. And that gray matter in there is mostly interneurons, and then the white matter on the outside is the myelinated axons that are carrying the impulses back to the brain. And so again, it's kind of an extension, but you can kind of see where kind of the different parts are. Whew. Okay, thanks for listening. Ask me questions, and I'll see you guys in class.